Snow swirled like white ashes over the lonely road. A barefoot little girl knelt in the frost, clutching a lifeless child wrapped in a torn blanket. "Please, just let me bury him," she cried as her stepmother slammed the door and hurled a suitcase into the snow. A black SUV screeched to a
It's all right. You'll be safe now.
The driver, a millionaire, stepped out, stunned. The girl's trembling hands, the frozen lips of the boy, the cruel echo of the woman's voice. He didn't yet know
I knew
that
you'd
this single
come.
moment would
Sing into my
rewrite
baby.
everything he believed.
What do you
about
want?
Mercy, loss, and love. If you want to know what happens next, stay with me until the end of the video.
Oh my
And if
goodness.
you still believe deep in your heart that God is always watching over you, silently arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment saying Amen below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write those words, a blessing may quietly enter your life. The morning
It's okay.
mist of Snow Ridge hung heavy that day, wrapping the
I'm
valley
right here
in a
with you.
soft silver fog. Snow drifted down like feathers, settling over the roof of a small wooden cabin that had once been filled with the smell of coffee and laughter. Now it stood silent, a hollow memory of the warmth it used to hold. Hazel Miller, only 6 years old, knelt on the frozen ground, her tiny knees sinking into the snow. In her trembling arms lay her little brother Noah, wrapped in a faded blue blanket. His face was pale, almost blending into the snow around them. She pressed her cheek against his cold skin, whispering through trembling lips, "Please, just let me bury him." Her stepmother Melissa stood at the doorway with crossed arms and eyes colder than the frost itself. She hurled a suitcase and a worn-out teddy bear into the snow. "Take your bad luck with you, Hazel. This house isn't yours anymore." The door slammed. The echo of it cut through the winter air like a blade. Hazel didn't move. She didn't cry. The world had gone still, and even the birds seemed to have flown away. Then from the distant road came the low hum of an engine. A black SUV stopped by the fence. The man who stepped out looked out of place in that silence, tall, dressed in a dark overcoat, his eyes heavy with something deeper than pity. Adrian Blake had seen tragedy before. 3 years earlier, his daughter Lila had died in a hospital because of a system failure, a mistake his own company had helped design. Since then, he had built walls around his heart. But when he saw the child in the snow, the little girl clutching her brother's body, those walls began to crack. He took off his coat, wrapped it around her small shoulders, and said quietly, "No child deserves to beg for a grave." Hazel lifted her eyes to him, unsure if he was real. For the first time that morning, she felt warmth, not from the coat, but from the voice that sounded like home. And just like that, 2 broken souls met under the falling snow, one seeking redemption, the other a place to belong. Adrian Blake stood by the roadside for a long moment, his breath fogging in the cold air, as he looked down at the 2 small figures before him. The girl didn't flinch when he offered his hand. She simply looked at him, her eyes empty, too old for 6 years. He knelt beside her and spoke softly. "What's your name, sweetheart Hazel?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "And this is Noah." Adrian's heart twisted at the sound of her brother's name. He took off his gloves and brushed the snow gently from the boy's cheek. The child looked as if he were only sleeping. "Let's get you both out of the cold," Adrian said, though only one of them could still be saved. He carried Hazel and the small, still body to his car, wrapping both in the thick blanket from the back seat. As the SUV drove away from the lonely cabin, Hazel kept her eyes fixed on the rear-view mirror, watching the house that had once been her world grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the fog. That house used to smell like coffee. Her father, Evan Miller, had opened a small cafe right after Hazel was born. Morning Haven, he'd called it, a place where people could start their day with warmth and kindness. Hazel used to sit on the counter every morning swinging her legs while her dad poured coffee into mugs and hummed old country songs. Her favourite was the one that said, "Sunshine follows the rain." He called her Sunshine. It was written on his mug, a small ceramic cup with fading letters, "Love you, Sunshine." But the songs had stopped a year ago when Evan Miller's heart had suddenly failed. The doctor said it was a heart attack. Melissa, the new wife who had once been a waitress at the cafe, cried in front of everyone. The town believed her. Only Hazel noticed the way Melissa's hands shook when she touched the old coffee cup her father used every morning, and how she quickly hid a small brown bottle in the kitchen drawer. After her father died, Melissa sold most of the cafe's furniture, saying she needed the money to keep the place running. The laughter disappeared. The smell of coffee turned to the stench of cheap wine. Derek Shaw, a man with too much cologne and too little conscience, began coming around her more often. He was always talking in whispers with Melissa, their words slipping between cigarette smoke and greed. Then slowly the meals grew smaller. Noah's cheeks became thin. Melissa stopped buying groceries altogether. Hazel would sneak small pieces of bread into her pocket, trying to feed her brother when no one was looking. One night, Noah had a fever. Hazel begged Melissa to take him to a doctor. Melissa slapped her instead. "You and your brother are nothing but burdens," she spat. The next morning, the boy didn't wake up. Now, sitting in Adrian's car, Hazel pressed her face into the coat that smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. He was cold, she whispered more to herself than to Adrian. I tried to keep him warm. Adrian didn't answer. He couldn't. The lump in his throat was too thick. He only reached over and gently held her small hand. They arrived at the Snow Ridge County Hospital, where the white walls and fluorescent lights felt like another kind of winter. The nurse took Noah's body away, gently, promising to take care of him. Hazel's fingers clung to the edge of the blanket until the nurse disappeared through the door. Adrian stayed beside her through the entire process. He made the calls, signed, the forms spoke in a calm voice that hid the storm behind it. When Hazel began to shake uncontrollably, he pulled her close and said quietly, "You're safe now." But even as he said it, he knew she wasn't, not yet. Later, as snow began to fall again outside the hospital window, Hazel sat on the bench in the waiting room, her feet dangling above the floor. She held the coffee cup from her backpack, the same one with the faded letters. She turned it slowly in her hands and said almost in a whisper, "It still smells like Dad." Adrian looked at her and felt something in him shift, the same ache he'd felt the day he lost Lila. Back then, he had told himself he would never try to save anyone again. He'd failed once. He couldn't bear to fail twice. But now, looking at Hazel, that promise felt hollow. The nurse came back and handed him a clipboard. "She needs a guardian," she said softly. "There's no one else on record." Adrian hesitated. His life had no space for this, for a child, for grief that wasn't his. And yet, as Hazel's head leaned against his arm and her small fingers held tightly onto his coat, the answer became clear. "I'll take responsibility," he said quietly. "For her. For now." The nurse nodded, scribbling on the form. Hazel didn't say a word, but she looked up at him, eyes wide and uncertain. Outside, the snow kept falling silent, endless, covering the town that had once turned its back on her. And for the first time since her father's death, Hazel felt that maybe, just maybe, someone was finally standing on her side. The next morning, the winter sun tried to break through the clouds, but barely managed to cast a pale light over Snow Ridge. The town looked quiet from the hospital window, a postcard frozen in white. Inside, Adrian Blake was filling out more forms than he had in years. Every line asked the same question in different words. Who are you to this child? He didn't know how to answer that. Not yet. Hazel sat nearby in a chair too big for her, wearing a wool sweater the nurse had found in Lost and Found. The sleeves swallowed her small hands. Her hair, soft and golden, framed her pale face. She stared at the mug on her lap. Love you, sunshine, tracing the letters with her finger, as if the warmth of her father's hand still lingered there. Adrian watched her quietly, remembering another morning years ago when his own daughter Lila sat in a hospital room not unlike this one. She had been 9, her cheeks flushed with fever, her small voice asking him, "Daddy, are you still there?" He had promised her he would be. But when the machines failed, when his own company's software malfunctioned, he had been powerless. Since that day, he had lived behind walls of work and silence. The world saw him as a billionaire visionary, brilliant, but inside he was just a man who hadn't forgiven himself. Now this fragile child was sitting across from him. Her world shattered just like his had been. "Hazel," he said softly, pulling up a chair beside her. "Do you have any family we can call?" She shook her head. "Just Daddy." "But he's gone." He hesitated. "What about your mother?" Her lips pressed together, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she said, almost like a secret, "She left when I was a baby. Daddy said she liked the ocean more than the snow." Adrian smiled faintly. That sounds like something a good man would say. Silence filled the space again. The clock ticked. The snow outside thickened. Finally, Hazel looked up at him. "Are they going to take me away?" Her question hit harder than he expected. Adrian took a slow breath before answering. "No, not if I can help it." He didn't know where the words came from. Maybe from guilt or instinct, or the ghost of Lila whispering inside his chest. But as soon as he said them, they became real. That afternoon, he spoke with Claudia Rivers, an old friend and attorney who had once stood by him during the lawsuit after Lila's death. "You're doing this again," she warned over the phone. "Saving someone to make peace with yourself." Maybe Adrian admitted. "But this time I think it's different. This girl, she's not a project. She's a person who deserves a chance." Claudia sighed. "All right. I'll help you get temporary guardianship. But Adrian, be careful. You know how these things get twisted." He did. He knew the world loved to tear down a man who tried to do the right thing. That night, Hazel couldn't sleep. She sat by the window of the hospital room watching the snow fall under the streetlight. When Adrian entered quietly, she turned to him and whispered, "It's pretty when it's quiet." He sat beside her. "Do you like the snow?" She shrugged. "Daddy said snow is how heaven touches the earth, but it's cold when you're alone." Adrian didn't answer right away. He looked out at the snow, at the reflection of her small face against the glass. "Hazel," he said finally, "I can't change what's happened, but I can promise you this: from now on, you don't kneel alone." She didn't fully understand what he meant, but she nodded anyway, as if she did. Then hesitantly, she reached out and slipped her hand into his. It was small and cold, but it gripped his like someone who had decided not to fall again. For the first time in years, Adrian felt something break open inside him. Not pain, not guilt, something gentler. hope. The next day, they left the hospital together. The nurse handed Hazel a paper bag with her few belongings. The teddy bear, the mug, a small sweater that still smelled faintly of smoke from the cabin. Adrian held her hand as they stepped outside. The snow crunched under their feet. Hazel looked up at him and asked, "Where are we going now, home?" Adrian said. Then after a pause, he added softly, "For now, until we figure out the rest." She nodded as if that was all she needed to hear. As the car drove down the long white road out of Snow Ridge, Hazel leaned her head against the window, watching the world pass by in a blur of frost and light. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in her short life, the road ahead didn't feel endless. Inside the SUV, Adrian reached for the car heater, adjusting it toward her side. Then he looked out the windshield, his mind whispering a silent vow, one he hadn't dared make since Lila's last breath. This time, he thought, "I won't let the lights go out." 2 weeks passed. The snow had turned from soft white to hard ice, covering the sidewalks of Snow Ridge like glass. Inside Adrian's home, a quiet modern house on the edge of town, the fireplace burned low and steady. Hazel had begun to speak more little by little. She was still shy, but there was a calm steadiness in her, now something Adrian had not seen before. She spent her mornings drawing beside the window. Sometimes she drew her old home, the cafe her father. Other times she drew a house with a light in every window, the kind she had never lived in. Adrian worked from home those days, attending meetings through his laptop while keeping an eye on Hazel. His team at Blake Tech had grown used to hearing the sound of a child humming faintly in the background. He didn't explain and no one asked. But peace, as Adrian knew too well, never lasted long. One afternoon, Claudia called. Her voice was tight. "Adrian, we need to talk. The Snow Ridge police just confirmed something. The stepmother, Melissa Grant, she's contesting your guardianship. She's claiming you took Hazel without permission." Adrian leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "She abandoned the child in the snow." "I know," Claudia said, "but she's filed a report and leaked the story to the media. There's a photo circulating online, a still from a neighbor's security camera. It looks like you're carrying the girl's body into your SUV. They're spinning it as a kidnapping." Adrian closed his eyes for a moment. The world had changed since he last fought a battle like this, and now stories didn't need truth to destroy someone. By evening, headlines began to appear on gossip sites. Tech mogul Adrian Blake under investigation for child abduction. Mystery girl found in billionaire's home. The comments came fast. Another rich man hiding secrets. He probably bought her silence. Where are the parents? Hazel didn't see the articles, but Adrian did everything to keep it that way. He deleted notifications, turned off the TV, tried to shield her. Yet the storm outside was growing too strong to ignore. Meanwhile, back in the darkened house that used to be Morning Haven, Melissa Grant was drinking wine straight from the bottle her lipstick smudged. Derek Shaw sat across the table, his phone lighting up with messages. "They're on to us," he said sharply. "That man's got lawyers, money and connections. You said the insurance paperwork was destroyed." "It was," Melissa snapped. "I burned everything except the original file your stepdaughter took." Derek said coldly, "Hazel has the real policy. If that surfaces, we're finished." Melissa froze. Her mind raced. "Then we find her." Derek's tone grew darker. "We don't just find her. We take back what she's hiding. Unbeknownst to them, the neighbour, an older man named Mr. Lawn, had begun to suspect what really happened. He had quietly saved the video from the night Melissa and Derek argued over the insurance money. He'd seen enough to know something wasn't right. Now he sat in his small living room watching the clip on repeat, Melissa's voice saying clearly, "The shop's mine. Those kids were just collateral." He hesitated, then called the local sheriff's office. Back at Adrian's house, the evening grew heavy. Hazel sat curled on the couch, the teddy bear in her arms. She looked at Adrian as he entered the room holding a folder in one hand. "Who's that woman?" she asked softly. "The one who says she's my mum now." Adrian sat down beside her. "Her name is Melissa. She's not your mother, Hazel. And she's not going to hurt you again." Hazel nodded, her lips trembling. She said Daddy fell asleep forever because of me. Adrian's chest ached. He reached out and placed his hand over hers. "Hazel, your father's death wasn't your fault. Do you understand? Some people lie when they're afraid of the truth." She stared at him for a moment, then nodded, but the tears still came. Later that night, after Hazel had fallen asleep, Adrian stood at his desk, staring at the documents Claudia had sent. Medical records, insurance forms, toxicology reports. The deeper he read, the colder the room seemed to get. It wasn't just neglect. Evan Miller had been poisoned, a gradual dose of medication meant for heart failure. The traces matched a prescription that Melissa had ordered under her husband's name, and the cafe's life insurance policy. It had been rewritten weeks before his death, but Hazel's copy of the original contract found inside that little coffee mug showed the truth. Adrian realized then that this wasn't just about saving a child. It was about exposing a rot that ran deeper into the financial system, the insurance web, maybe even the companies that had once worked with his own. He looked toward Hazel's room, the faint glow of her nightlight spilling into the hallway. That light, soft and fragile, reminded him of everything he'd lost and everything he still had a chance to protect. He turned back to the window. Outside, the snow had started again, fine, silent flakes drifting against the glass. Somewhere in that quiet darkness, the storm was only beginning. Adrian whispered to himself, "If they want a war, they'll have one. But this time, I fight clean for her." By late January, the snow in Snow Ridge began to thaw. Beneath the melting ice, the truth was starting to surface, cold, quiet, and dangerous. Adrian Blake had turned his study into a war room. Papers covered the desk, medical charts, bank records, the original insurance document Hazel had kept hidden inside her father's mug. He spent every night piecing it together, like a puzzle only grief could solve. Claudia Rivers joined him most evenings. She'd seen too many broken systems to be surprised, but this case was different. Evan Miller didn't die from a heart attack, she said, tapping the coroner's report. The dosage was deliberate. Melissa administered it over weeks. Derek Shaw handled the paperwork. Adrian rubbed his temples. "And the insurance company, same firm that's tied to 2 other suspicious deaths in Vermont," Claudia replied. "All linked to Shaw." Silence hung heavy between them. Outside, the wind howled across the empty streets, rattling the window like a warning. Meanwhile, Hazel sat on the living room floor, quietly colouring with her crayons. Her drawings had changed fewer graves, more houses with lights in the windows. Yet every picture still had the same 2 words scrawled in uneven handwriting: Dad's Haven. When Adrian stepped out to check on her, she asked softly, "Do bad people always get away?" He crouched beside her, Not forever. Sometimes the truth just takes longer to be found. Hazel looked at her picture again and whispered, "Then we'll wait for it." The next morning, Adrian and Claudia met with the county medical examiner, an older man whose eyes were weary from too many quiet deaths. He studied the new evidence for a long time before saying, "You're right. The traces of a medication are unnatural. I'll file an amendment to the original report, but be careful, Mr. Blake. People who profit from silence don't like men who ask questions." That night, Adrian came home to find the back door open and footprints melting into the snow. His security alarm hadn't gone off. Someone had known exactly how to bypass it. Hazel's backpack was on the floor, empty. Her father's coffee mug lay shattered beside it. Hazel's cry pierced through the house. "It's gone. The paper. Daddy signed. It's gone." Adrian knelt beside her, picking up the fragments. "They took the paper," she sobbed. "Now they'll say Daddy's death doesn't matter." He took her hand gently. "Hazel, look at me. I scanned the document days ago. The proof is safe. They can't erase the truth anymore." She wiped her tears, her voice trembling. "Will they come back? They might," Adrian said softly. "But this time we're ready." The next morning, Claudia called. "It's official. Melissa's gone on camera. She's accusing you of kidnapping and manipulating a child for money. The story's everywhere." Adrian turned on the TV. Melissa's image filled the screen, fake tears, trembling voice. "He took Hazel from me," she said. "I just want my stepdaughter home." News anchors repeated the lie, spinning it into a scandal. Drones hovered above Adrian's property. Reporters gathered outside his gate. Inside the house, Hazel hid under a blanket on the couch. "They hate you now," she whispered. Adrian crouched beside her. "They don't know the truth yet, but they will." That evening, Claudia filed a motion for temporary guardianship legal protection for Hazel until the investigation was complete. Adrian signed the documents without hesitation. His signature was steady this time. No more ghosts, no more hesitation. When Hazel came into his office later, she held a candle she had found in the kitchen, small, flickering golden. She placed it on the table beside his papers. "For light," she said quietly, "so you don't have to fight in the dark." Adrian smiled faintly, the glow reflecting in his tired eyes. "Thank you, sunshine." Outside, the wind began to rise again, pushing flurries against the window. But inside that single flame burned steady, a promise that the darkness wouldn't win this time. The courthouse in Snow Ridge was an old brick building that had seen decades of winters. On the morning of the hearing, the snow fell hard again, as if the sky itself wanted to test their resolve. Adrian arrived early, his coat dusted white, Hazel walking beside him, her small hand wrapped in his. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Melissa sat across the aisle, perfectly dressed, her smile sharp as glass. Derek Shaw wasn't there. He had fled the state the week before after a warrant was issued for his arrest. When the judge entered the room, quieted. Claudia stood beside Adrian, her voice steady as she presented the evidence, the amended coroner's report, the bank transactions, and finally the video from the neighbor's camera. The screen flickered to life. Melissa's voice filled the room. "The shop's mine. Those kids were just collateral." A ripple of shock passed through the courtroom. Melissa's face turned pale, her composure cracking like ice. The prosecutor stepped forward, holding the forensic report. Evan Miller was poisoned by his spouse. The motive was financial gain. The secondary victim, Noah Miller, died due to neglect. The surviving child, Hazel Miller, was abandoned and left to die in the snow. For a long moment, no one spoke. The judge finally turned to Melissa. "Do you deny any of this?" Melissa's lips trembled. "I didn't mean for it to go that far." Hazel's small voice broke the silence. "You said it was my fault." Melissa turned toward her, eyes wide, but Hazel didn't flinch. She stood beside Adrian, her head held high the way he'd taught her with quiet strength. When the verdict came, it felt like the air itself exhaled. Melissa Grant was found guilty of fraud, neglect, and manslaughter. Adrian Blake was granted full guardianship of Hazel Miller. Snow drifted outside the tall windows as the gavel struck. Hazel's hand tightened around Adrian's. He leaned down and whispered, "It's over now, sunshine." But Hazel shook her head. "No," she said softly. "It's just beginning." Weeks later, spring arrived early in Snow Ridge. The cafe reopened under a new name, Haven Café, painted in soft shades of blue and gold. The first morning sunlight streamed through the windows, touching the polished counter and the framed photo of Evan and Noah by the register. Adrian poured the first cup of coffee and handed it to Hazel. "You do the honors," he said. She carried it outside to the small garden behind the cafe where two headstones rested side by side beneath a blooming maple tree. She placed the cup between them. "Dad," she whispered. Noah's warm now. The breeze carried her words away gently, like a prayer. That evening, as twilight settled, Hazel stood by the window watching the lights come on across the town. The world looked different, not perfect, but safe. Adrian joined her holding 2 mugs of cocoa. "How's the view?" She smiled faintly. "No more dark," she said. "Just home." And as the cafe glowed against the quiet night, the snow melted for the last time, leaving behind the warmth of 2 souls who had found their way back to the light. Today's story comes to an end, but its echo still lingers in the heart. What do you think? Give us a score from 1 to 10 and feel free to share a few words in the comments. Every voice here is valued and heard. Before you go, let me ask you gently, are you doing okay today? If your heart feels heavy, let this place be a quiet corner where you can share and find comfort. See you again in the next bedtime story, where love and hope remind us that no matter how dark the night may seem, kindness will always prevail.